Hello everyone, and welcome to the third and final lecture for Chapter 6. So this is Module 3, and I know I say this all the time, but I promise this is going to be a very short lecture. I tend to get kind of carried away and maybe talk about things a little bit more than I should sometimes, but in this case I can guarantee you that this lecture is not going to last any more than 15 minutes tops. It's just a quick 5-slide lecture on a couple of the key concepts for Module 3, and then basically this will be our lecture for next Monday, October 12th. So if you are having a little bit of trouble finishing up the lectures for Module 1 and 2, you can take the extra time on that day to kind of finish them up after you've reviewed this module, because I guarantee it won't be very long. So we'll get started. Our third module is on cognitive and observational learning. So we're going to talk about two concepts. One which is latent learning, and the other one which is observational learning, and we'll just discuss them very briefly and give a few examples, and then we'll be done with this section. So latent learning was something noticed primarily, or I guess initially, by Edward Tolman. He was conducting research with rats who basically he was placing in a maze, and they could kind of explore the maze, and the end goal in a lot of cases was to get to the middle of the maze to obtain a treat. So he noticed that his rats seemed to pause while they were deciding where to go in a maze. So it seemed like they were kind of thinking about where they should go next, and that they appeared to be learning even without being reinforced. So we had 3 different groups of rats. One that always found food. So from day 1, there was always a treat in the center of the maze. The second group never found food, so there was never a treat in the middle of the maze. And then the third group began to find food only after 10 days had already elapsed. So essentially what he saw is that even though within those first 10 days, that third group weren't being reinforced at all, they still appeared to be learning. And this was something that was a really big deal at the time, because when I mentioned Skinner in the last lecture, I mentioned that he was very big on kind of observable behavior and giving reinforcements and punishments, and that those are basically the only ways for us to change a behavior. So basically that learning would not occur unless you were being reinforced or punished. And Tolman essentially kind of proved that wrong in a way. So he was basically showing that even though the rats in the third group were not reinforced in any way during their first 10 days, the fact that as soon as he put them in on the 11th day and there was reinforcement, they started to find their way to the center of the maze much, much quicker than the initial group of rats had in their first few days, meant that they were learning something within that first day period. So he basically said that group 3 was demonstrating latent learning that was not immediately expressed and occurs without obvious reinforcement. So even though they weren't being reinforced for finding the center of the maze in those first 10 days, it was clear by how quickly they picked it up from the 11th day onward that they had in fact been learning things about the layout of the maze and how to find the middle of the maze within those first 10 days. So we see this type of learning quite often in humans. It raises the question of what exactly is being learned during operant conditioning. So now we're going to talk briefly about learning by observation. So observational learning, I'm sure, is something you've all heard of. It's basically changes in behaviors and knowledge that result from watching others. So for example, cultural customs, many of the customs of our particular culture, our particular kind of society, aren't really things that were ever explicitly taught. They're just kind of passed down from generation to generation, almost passively at times. So you don't have to necessarily have somebody sit down and teach you and tell you, remember what I'm doing. It's just through seeing certain behaviors and certain customs expressed over and over, we tend to kind of pick those things up. And another example would be from the animal kingdom, rats and their foraging behaviors. So there's actually, it's kind of cute when you think about it. Basically, when a rat comes home after finding food, so after it's foraged, it will let some of the other rats in its litter, in its den, or wherever rats live, smell its breath. And by smelling the rat's breath, they're able to kind of determine what it is they've eaten. And so they can then know that, whatever place those rats are foraging in is probably, a beneficial place for them to go as well to obtain food. So they actually kind of pass on that knowledge through kind of observation and the smelling of the other rat's breath. So behaviorists believe that this type of learning can be explained through stimulus response terms, so that it is still basically, reinforcements and punishments. But social learning theorists say we must take into account the thought processes of the learner. So learning doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's not all about stimulus and response relationships. There are certain behaviors that you could try to reinforce a human for. Say if you told somebody, I'll give you $10,000 if you hurt this person. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do it. There is some kind of amount of cognition and thoughts and morals and social values that come into play there. So we need to be taking into account the thought processes of the learner as well. So a researcher named Albert Bandura identified 4 processes involved in observational learning, which are the attention to the act or behavior, so you must be paying attention to what it is that's going on. The memory for the act or behavior, so obviously you need to remember what it was that had occurred. The ability to reproduce it, so for example, having the motor ability to actually do something. I always like to give the example for this one. Well, I could watch people run a marathon all I want. I can watch them do it, pay attention to it, memorize what they did. That doesn't mean that I'm physically capable of getting up and running a marathon. So you still have to have that motor ability to produce it as well, and the motivation to do so. So you're not going to just, say for example, another example I often give is how to hammer a nail or screw in a screw. So maybe, growing up, you watched your mom or your dad use those types of tools, and so you kind of passively acquired that learning. So you watched them, you paid attention, you memorized the process, and you have the motor ability to reproduce it, but that doesn't mean you're just going to go around nailing nails into all the walls in your house. So you're probably going to only do it when you need to. So you're going to have some kind of motivation occur before you're going to be willing to reproduce that behavior. Observational learning has been implicated in the learning of aggressive behavior as well, unfortunately. So there was a famous Bobo doll study in which these big dolls, which were kind of like punching bags, were placed in a room, and children were watching videos of adults, and sometimes the adults would kind of hit or punch these dolls in whatever way, and it was observed that when children who had observed that violent behavior in adults were then placed in the same situation with those dolls, they were more likely to engage in that type of behavior as well. So here's a little diagram that kind of explains that learning by observation piece. So in order for this boy to learn how to shoot this arrow, he must pay attention to what the woman is doing. He must have memory of the event, so how she held things and kind of what was occurring. He must have the motor ability to reproduce the behavior, and he must have the motivation to do so. So it is important to note that teaching is not uniquely a human phenomenon. We have observed teaching behaviors in ants, macaque monkeys, killer whales, and more. So one of the primary mechanisms by which we learn through observation is known as imitation. So imitation is recreating someone else's motor behavior or expression, and it's often used to accomplish a specific goal. And as you probably can imagine, imitation is very common in humans. It's how we learn really a lot of our skills and abilities. So there are actually these really special cells in our brains known as mirror neurons. They're found in humans as well as monkeys, and they seem to play an important role in helping us learn observationally and understand other people's emotional states, among other functions. So these mirror neurons in our brain will actually activate when we are watching someone perform the same kind of function. So for example, if somebody is hammering in a nail, and they have certain neurons that are kind of being activated in their brain while they're doing so, our brain can actually show similar patterns of activation within these mirror neurons as the activation would be in the person who's actually performing the task. So it's kind of like those neurons help us to learn how to imitate people's behavior. And finally, the very last thing I'm going to touch on here, as I promised you, it's not going to be a long lecture, is does media violence make you violent? So findings on both latent and observational learning can help us think critically about the claims that watching violence in the media can make children more violent. So some studies have found that greater exposure to violence in movies or on television actually increases the likelihood of a person behaving aggressively. So that is something that has been found, but there are a few things that we need to keep in mind when interpreting that kind of finding. A lot of researchers feel that those results have been greatly exaggerated and that all of the factors that are correlated with aggressive behavior, playing violent video games would be by far the least correlated. So just because there is a relationship there and that relationship may be perceived as significant, it doesn't really mean that it is a big effect. So for example, the correlation between aggressive behavior and playing video games is only about 0.04, which is a very, very weak correlation, versus 0.75 for genetics. So genetics play a very strong role, or maybe not play a strong role, but have a very strong relationship to aggressive behavior. 0.58 for perceptions of criminal opportunity, so your perception of whether or not engaging in a criminal act would pay off. And 0.35 even just for owning a gun. So you can see that even though there is a relationship between the media violence and the aggressive behavior, it is far less strong of a relationship than has been seen for a lot of other factors. So your text examines the link between media exposure and behavior using the scientific literacy model, and there are several interesting results that are discussed in the Working the Scientific Literacy Model section on pages 248 to 49. So if you want to take a look at that, feel free. I'm not going to be testing you on anything that I haven't talked about here, but it is kind of interesting. It's a topic that a lot of people kind of seem interested in knowing more about. So if you would like to, you are free to read up a bit more about that in the book. So that is it for chapter 6. So as I mentioned, this lecture was super short. So really your main concepts to keep in mind here are going to be the definitions for latent learning and kind of what that looks like, as well as the definition for observational learning and those 4 processes that are involved. So this, I mentioned at the beginning, it's a lecture for Monday the 12th, but I forgot that that's actually the Thanksgiving holiday. So this one's actually the lecture for Wednesday the 14th. And then I do have a review that goes through a bunch of examples of operant and classical conditioning. So I'm hoping to maybe go through that next Friday. I might see if I can set up an optional Zoom call to kind of meet with me and go through that on Friday as well. And then in the following week on Monday, we'll have our actual scheduled Zoom class before our test, and then our next test should be that following Wednesday. So you still have a little bit of time left, a couple weeks from today until our next test. So if you have any questions on any of this content, feel free to let me know. You can either drop by during class time or you can email me. I would prefer that if you have like a big question about the content, that you ask it during the class chat rooms, just because 1, it saves me from having to type it out over and over again if other people ask it, and 2, then I can post that chat transcript to our group and then other people can see it afterwards as well. So I will let you go for now. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you again probably next Friday if we do that Zoom call. I will let you know.